So now let's start to get into this machine learning project. So at a high level, the idea that you had, so from your experience brewing at prior to Species X, you have a data set of several hundred rows where every row represents a different beer, where that beer was went out to the public and the public tasted it. So for each of those hundreds of rows, you have a couple hundred, well, I don't know, maybe not a couple hundred, several dozen columns of information. And so, and those things relate to things like what was the alcohol level, which is kind of easy to understand. So I'm looking at one of these spreadsheets right now, and so there's some beers have as little as 2%, some have 7%, some have 10%. But there's lots of other features in the data set related to ingredients that went in, that things that relate to the process that was followed, like temperatures that were used, ratios of different things to each other in the brewing process. So it provides this really rich feature set for training a machine learning model. And then, Beau, the really brilliant insight that you had was taking all of these features, which is already a rich proprietary data set. And the way that it's so well organized is mind blowing to me. It must have a huge amount of work went into organizing all of these inputs into a machine learning model. But then in order to be able to use all of those inputs, you could use an unsupervised machine learning approach that doesn't have labels. And you could kind of end up doing an exploratory analysis that would group related kinds of beers together based on these feature sets. But ideally, for brewing the most delicious beer possible, which is probably what a brewer is typically trying to do, it'd be great to have a label as to how delicious this beer is, and you obtained that. So you have this outcome, this label for all of these hundreds of rows that's based on consumer feedback. So it's a score rating, and there's it's a proprietary nature to this, but so I'm not going to go into too much detail of the score, but it's a numeric score that is consistent across all of these beers. And so it allows you to have a rating of what people think of the beer, how delicious it is. And so for these several hundred rows, all representing beers, you've got tons of rich features going in, and you've got this outcome that you can predict with a supervised learning model. And so you blended these model inputs with this feature set, and yeah, you've been training a machine learning model.
When I came up with the idea, it had to work with. So when I was setting up the data column, the feature columns, there actually is 180 columns total.
Okay, right. I had this idea in my head that it was 200, but when I just was skimming over it now,
it's about 200. But what I'll do is when we put guardrails up, we'll, depending on which model we're using, we'll shrink the training data, or just keep it the same. If we're using Behemoth, which is the model with every single bit of our data, or if we're doing Crisp P is my lager model, Crisp P, we'll narrow down the rows so it just includes lagers, and then we'll shuffle around and delete out some of the feature columns so that it's all related to lagers only. Where in Behemoth is just okay, how do I get from A to B to the most customer satisfaction with no disregard to style or anything? So that's what Behemoth is. And usually what comes out the other end is 10 to 15% alcohol beers, and a lot of stout influenced beers, but most of them are pretty off the wall crazy, and we'll try to navigate it to the ones that are practical to brew. So the one from Behemoth, for instance, that we'll be brewing here for the first time is I think it's a 8.5% Baltic Porter, which is a lager strain. It's got like 20 different malts in it. There's like dashes of certain malts, which I find fascinating. There's like lactose, marshmallows, vanilla, 3 different types of fruit. It's got a big whirlpool charge. Actually, just a normal like whirlpool charge of hops, which is really fascinating.
What does that mean? Whirlpool charge. Everything else kind of made sense to me, but
The whirlpool charge is just like a dosing of hops in the whirlpool stage of the beer. So
yeah. And what's that?
we'll
Whirlpool stage?
we'll hook it up in the kettle and we'll circle it after it's done boiling. And at that point, you can actually cool the wort down. So we'll cool it down to a certain temperature and then add hops if we need to. Usually, whirlpool charges happen for IPAs only. So this is why it was fascinating to me that like a model like Behemoth throws a completely novel way of brewing a Baltic Porter, especially at me to brew. And this is where I think like this is like really novel stuff. Like this, some of these styles they're not anything I've ever seen before. And as a domain expert, I guess you could call me, just from brewing for several years or 7, 8 years now. I can look at a recipe that it generates and be like, wow, this is doable. And it sounds pretty nuts, but I want to brew it and see how it goes. So there's that generative, I don't know if I would call it a generative AI, but it's definitely supervised.
Yeah,
it's definitely supervised machine learning.
Yeah. So so you and I have had a few meetings, and so we were like, okay, let's brew. Like I agreed to help out and give you a bit of feedback on what you've been doing, the great impressive work you've been doing on your data collection and your modeling. And so we were like, okay, so we're going to have this collaboration beer. And as I already mentioned, I was like, I don't really like IPAs typically, so let's remove them from the data. And so you've been working on a lager. So we reduced the data down to just the loggers that were in the data set, and you trained. So you use these AutoML processes to identify crisp P, your logger only model, supervised learning model for predicting how people would probably taste one of your tens of thousands of simulated recipes. And yeah, so how's that coming along? Where are you at the time of recording? Where is the beer? And I guess we can tell people the name of the beer.
Yeah, I think so. So I tasted this beer yesterday for the first time, and out of all the lagers I've ever made, it's up there. It might be the best, like the best lager I've ever made.
Wow, that's unreal. Wow, I'm so happy to hear it. I was worried that we'd get on air, do all this rigmarole, and then you'd be like, we got to go back to the drawing board. We should have been using K nearest neighbors instead of boosted trees after all. Why did I ensemble tab PFN? We can talk about this in a bit more detail when you and I were looking over the results that came out of your proprietary supervised learning process. So you had these tens of thousands of rows simulated using the parameter constraints that you had on inputs, and then you had your crisp P supervised learning model go over all of those 10,000 simulated rows and predict what people would rate. One of those came out by some margin at the very top, and that's this beer that you've been brewing. But there were some things about the features in it that, as I was, to me, it doesn't mean anything. When I'm looking at the inputs into your model, like most of them don't make any sense to me. I'm like, okay, I get like the alcohol content, like that one makes sense to me, and I can kind of through going over your sheet a few times, like I've learned, okay, like these are these are the hops, and like this is the massive hops, and this is, but like that doesn't mean anything to me. Like I can't infer how that could possibly relate to the way that a beer tastes. But so as you were reviewing this lager that came out number one, by far in terms of how consumers are predicted to rate it, you saw some unusual things. Your eyes kind of lit up. What are those kinds of things that you saw?
Well, the main thing was Maris Otter. It called for, which is really fascinating because a majority of lagers do not use Maris Otter. That's mostly bound to stouts and pale ales and IPAs. So I thought that was really interesting. Not too crazy, but I thought that was fascinating. There was again, a really large hop addition, and large for a lager, a large hop addition in the whirlpool. Not a ton of hops in the kettle, and no dry hopping. And in addition to that, there was also it called for sugar as well, a very certain type of sugar, which was called it's a D45 candy syrup. So we threw that in as well. And I forget what else. I'll have to take a look at that later. But I think there's different types of malt in there. Nothing too crazy, but I think there was wheat in there as well. So, anyways, as I'm brewing this and throwing candy syrup in it and doing the weird whirlpool charge, I was like, this is so bizarre, but in a really cool way. I feel like there's like an alien telling me what to do. And it makes sense. Like, I just know that like a person would never suggest brewing this like usually. But it's coming out amazing. It's so unbelievably smooth, really light, and has knife a nice like depth of character and flavor. But and it's just, as I said, super clean, easy to drink. So we'll go ahead. It's about done fermentation, so it'll be conditioning for a couple weeks probably before we tap it, and package it. So
Amazing.
I'm super excited about it.
I've had an ear to ear smile as you've been describing this. It's been such a wild process. It's quite different. It's completely different from any kind of project that I've ever been associated with. And I played an extremely small part in this. This is really your project. You've done all the hard work on this, and it's fantastic to see what's come out. But that particular thing that you're describing there, and I think that shows the real value in what you're doing at Species X, at least on the silicon side of things. With these silicon species, it's just like you're saying, like an alien directing you what to do. And so, you've spent years now, particularly quite a bit of time over the last year, though that doesn't include all the time you spent getting the data together. But you've invested years in aggregate into data collection, modeling, and also just training yourself on the side. And for that to come together and produce this result, which I guess we still haven't had the final taste, but it's come along now that you have a pretty good sense of it. For me, the two most exciting points in this whole process were going over this top-rated result that came out of your Crisp P model, the beer that it selected, seeing your eyes light up as you talked about things like the Maris Otter, which is a particular kind of barley malt. And as you say, like a flavor that people wouldn't think to typically put in a lager, combined with things like the specific syrup that you mentioned. Lots of hops added at the whirlpool stage, which I was like, oh man, like I don't like IPAs, and now you're at it. Now the algorithm suggested all these hops. It ruined everything after all. And you're like, no, it's okay, because at the whirlpool stage, lots of hops. They won't create too much bitterness in the flavor, like they would if they were added earlier on in the process. And so I was like, okay, cool. Like, let's go for it. This sounds like a beer based on what you're describing that I would like. And it sounds so that was one really exciting stage in this. And then the second really exciting stage is right now to be able to hear that it's working out, because you don't know for sure with machine learning models. And most historically for me, in fact, maybe 100% of the time, with any other machine learning model I've ever been involved with in more than 15 years of working on commercial machine learning projects, all the other times I can know what the results are going to be like right away. I can see them on my screen. Does this work or does it not work? But with what you've done, it was going to be a couple of months from like, okay, this is the recipe it suggested. It's like a marionette to Beau, like an alien telling you what to do as you go through creating this beer, and you don't really know how it's going to turn out until the end. And so for it to be seeming like it's going to work out is super exciting. And so it sounds like February 8th in Columbus, Ohio, at the Species X Brewery. If we have listeners in Columbus, Ohio, actually, I do know that we have some Columbus, Ohio listeners, and I'll be reaching out to friends that I have in the city. And some friends may even come from far and wide of mine to come on February 8th and try out this Maris Otter lager that your Chris P algorithm has suggested. Can we tell people the expected name of the
Oh
beer?
yeah, it's called Krohn and Borg. If you want to go into depth on that.
Yeah, so it's this is actually a hat tip to my sister Stevie for coming up with this idea. So there is, of course, a very famous French beer called Kronenberg out of a city called Kronenberg. And so it's a very popular lager, particularly in Europe, but you see it on a lot of taps in the US as well. It's a pretty common, kind of like you'll see it alongside Stella's and Heineken's. So yeah, get your Kronenberg beer. And then so the idea here is it takes advantage of my last name, Krohn. It helps people, nudge them in the direction of pronouncing it properly, which is nice for me. Um, and then it also adds in, if people are familiar with Star Trek, the Borg are these robots that become a big problem in the Star Trek series, specifically like the one that I grew up on, Star Trek: The Next Generation, in the '90s. They're kind of like the arch nemesis to Jean-Luc Picard and the Star Trek. So, and the robots. So it's this idea of AI blended with humans, Krohn and Borg, and kind of rolls off the tongue. I wanted to call it Cronenborg 2064 to play on they called it Cronenberg's 1664 for their lager, but your marketing team said that might be cutting it too close.
Yeah, it might be a little too close. Yeah,
treading on trademark issues. But that would have been a funny thing. But yeah, Krohn and Borg. I'm so excited, Beau, for February 8th to come out to Columbus and try it out. And we will also I'll be recording a shorter episode, probably a Friday episode, while I'm there. Getting some feedback on the beer and answering maybe people's data science questions together to round out. So there will be an episode coming in the future on how the Kronenborg beer turned out from this amazing project that I am so grateful you invited me to play a small part in. Thanks a lot, Beau.
Yeah, I appreciate you to take the time to collaborate on this. It means a lot. And I, like you mentioned, I'm mostly self-taught in this. I have a little bit of formal education from OSU, but nothing super complex and over the top. So having you to come in and validate that what I was doing was, the correct way to do things, and making amazing suggestions into possible future iterations was really helpful.